In my family, memories weren't cherished. They were curated. Our smiles and photographs were as carefully arranged as the prize-winning roses in my grandmother's garden, each one pruned and perfected for public display. We were the Covingtons of Harmony Creek, Georgia, a name that tasted like old money and sweet tea on the tongues of the townsfolk. Our home, a white-pillared monolith set back from the road by a sprawling lawn of impossible green, was not a house, but a statement. It spoke of legacy, of tradition, of an unshakable place in the world. But I remember the thorns, the ones that grew beneath the perfect blossoms, sharp and venomous and hidden from view. I remember the rot that festered at the roots, a sickness that seeped into the very foundations of that grand old house. The annual Covington Garden Party, held every year in that brief, glorious window when late spring in Georgia felt like a blessing rather than a curse, was the apex of my family's performance. It was the day the curated memory was offered up to the world. That year, the year I turned 16, the air was thick with the scent of blooming magnolias and freshly cut grass, a perfume so sweet it was suffocating. White tents dotted the lawn like sails on a calm sea, and beneath them, the high society of Harmony Creek mingled, their laughter as light and brittle as the crystal glasses in their hands. I stood near the edge of the flagstone patio, a ghost in a pale yellow dress my mother had chosen. She'd said it brought out the gold in my hair, but all I felt was the way it clung, a second skin I wanted to shed. My mother, Sarah, was a master of appearances. She drifted through the crowd with a practiced grace, her smile a dazzling, empty thing. A moment before, she had fussed with a stray curl near my temple, her fingers pinching slightly. "Stand up straight, Emma," she'd murmured, her eyes not on me, but on Mrs. Abernathy from the Historical Society who was approaching. "And for heaven's sake, look like you're enjoying yourself. People are watching." People were always watching. That was the first rule of being a Covington. My brother Michael, 2 years my senior and already cast in the mold of our grandfather, held court near the fountain. He was laughing, a loud, confident sound that drew people in. He was the golden boy, the heir apparent, and he wore the title as easily as he wore his tailored blazer. He caught my eye once, a flicker of something, annoyance, pity, before turning back to his adoring audience. We were siblings, but we orbited in different universes. His was the sun. Mine was the distant, cold shadow. My father, David, stood where he always stood, in the orbit of his own father. He was a tall man, but he seemed to shrink in my grandfather's presence, his shoulders perpetually stooped as if under an invisible weight. He nodded along to whatever story was being told, his face a mask of dutiful attention. I watched him and felt a familiar, aching pang of disappointment. He was my father, but he belonged to his mom. And then there was them. My grandparents, the king and queen of this carefully constructed kingdom. My grandmother, Eleanor, sat on a wrought iron bench beneath the sprawling branches of a century-old oak. She didn't mingle. People came to her, an audience granted before a monarch. She was elegant, her silver hair coiled in an impeccable chignon, her back ramrod straight. Her gaze swept over the party, missing nothing, her expression a placid, unreadable mask. She was the guardian of the family's honor, the silent enforcer of its myriad unspoken rules. Her silence was more powerful than any shout, and my grandfather, Arthur Covington. To the world, he was a titan. He was charm incarnate, a man who could command a boardroom or a backyard barbecue with the same easy grace. His voice was a low, warm rumble that made women blush and men lean in closer. He moved through his party now, a hand on this person's shoulder, a shared laugh with that one. He was the sun around which we all revolved, and the heat he gave off could feel like a comforting warmth or a searing burn. I felt his eyes on me before he even changed direction. It was a physical sensation, a prickling on the back of my neck. I kept my gaze fixed on a bee droning over a bed of hydrangeas, praying he would pass me by. A foolish prayer. He never did. "There's my girl." His voice was right behind me, and I had to fight the urge to flinch. I turned, forcing my lips into the shape of a smile. "Hello, grandfather. Enjoying the festivities?" he asked, though it wasn't a real question. His eyes, a pale, piercing blue so like my own, scanned my face. They always seemed to be searching for something, some crack in the facade. "It's a lovely party," I said, the words tasting like ash. Of course it is. He smiled, a flash of white against his tanned skin. He placed a hand on the small of my back, a proprietary gesture. It rested there, a spot of heat against the thin fabric of my dress. Come, walk with me. There's someone I want you to meet. He guided me away from the patio, his hand a firm pressure steering me across the lawn. We passed my mother, who gave us a small, tight nod of approval, a sign that I was playing my part correctly. We passed my father, who met my desperate gaze for a fraction of a second before looking down at his shoes. There was no help there. There was never any help. "Judge Miller," my grandfather boomed, his hand still on my back. "I'd like you to meet my granddaughter, Emma." The judge, a portly man with a face like a bulldog, beamed at me. "A pleasure, young lady. You're the spitting image of your grandmother when she was your age." "She has her grandmother's eyes," Arthur corrected smoothly, his thumb stroking my back in a small circular motion that made my skin crawl. "But she has my spirit. She's the future of this family, our special legacy." The words hung in the air between us. To the judge, it was the doting praise of a proud patriarch. To me, it felt like a brand. He was marking his territory. I murmured something polite, my voice sounding distant and strange to my own ears. My grandfather's grip tightened for a moment, a silent warning, before he guided me away. This was his ritual. He would parade me around, his prize, his possession. He would talk about my future, a future he was already mapping out, as if my life were a piece of property on a game board. With every introduction, every compliment he paid me that was actually a compliment to himself, the gilded cage grew smaller, the bars colder and harder. When he finally released me near the rose garden, my back was aching with tension. "Go on now," he said, his voice soft again. "Go be a pretty young thing amongst the flowers." I fled, my heart hammering against my ribs. The rose garden was my grandmother's domain, a labyrinth of perfect blooms. I ducked behind a trellis heavy with climbing white roses, their scent cloying. I pressed my forehead against the cool, rough wood and squeezed my eyes shut, trying to breathe. This was my life. Moments of suffocating attention followed by brief, desperate gasps for air and hiding. The party eventually wound down as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in lurid shades of orange and pink. The last of the cars crunched down the gravel driveway, and a heavy silence fell over the house, a silence that was somehow more menacing than the noise. The staff moved like wraiths, clearing away the evidence of the day's performance. I escaped to my room, a sanctuary on the second floor with pale blue walls and white lace curtains. It was a girl's room, a beautiful room, but tonight it felt like a stage set for a play I didn't want to be in. I peeled off the yellow dress, letting it fall to the floor in a heap. In the shower, I scrubbed at my skin, trying to wash away the feeling of his hand on my back, the memory of his possessive words, but the feeling lingered, a phantom touch I couldn't erase. Dressed in an old soft t-shirt and pajama pants, I curled up on my window seat, looking out into the deepening twilight. The garden below was cloaked in shadows. The white tents were gone, and all that remained were ghosts. I felt a profound loneliness settle over me, as vast and empty as the darkening sky. Later, I was in bed, drifting in that hazy space between wakefulness and sleep, when I heard it. A soft, hesitant knock on my door. My heart gave a hopeful little leap. Mother. Maybe she'd come to say goodnight. Maybe she'd seen the look in my eyes and had come to ask, really ask, if I was okay. "Yes?" I called out, my voice thick with sleep. The door creaked open. The figure standing in the sliver of light from the hallway was not my mother. It was him. My grandfather. My entire body went rigid. A cold, metallic taste filled my mouth. "Grandfather, what is it?" He stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. He was holding a small, velvet-covered box. "I didn't get to give you your birthday gift with all the commotion," he said, his voice a low whisper. It was the voice he used when he wanted to sound gentle, but it scraped against my nerves like sandpaper. My birthday had been a week ago. He walked toward the bed. I shrank back against the headboard, pulling the covers up to my chin. The room, my sanctuary, suddenly felt tiny, airless. His cologne, a scent of sandalwood and something sharp like gin, filled the space, choking me. "You don't need to be frightened, Emma," he murmured, sitting on the edge of my bed, the mattress dipped under his weight, rolling me slightly toward him. A man ought to be able to give his favorite girl a gift. He opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of white satin, was a delicate pearl necklace. It was beautiful, classic, and I hated it with every fiber of my being. "Every young lady of quality needs a string of pearls," he said, his eyes not on the necklace, but on my face, my neck, the rise and fall of the blanket over my chest. "You're coming of age now, becoming a woman. It's an important time, a time of duty." He reached out, not with the necklace, but with his hand, and brushed a strand of hair from my forehead. His fingers were dry and cool. I flinched, a small, involuntary movement. His smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. "There now." "No need for that." He picked up the necklace. "Let me." I shook my head, a tiny, almost imperceptible motion. "I can do it." "Nonsense." "I insist." He leaned closer, and I was trapped between him and the headboard. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for it to be over. I felt the cold pearls against my skin, then his fingers fumbling with the clasp at the back of my neck. His knuckles brushed against my nape, and a violent shudder ran through me. The clasp was done, but he didn't move away. His hand slid from the nape of my neck down my spine, a slow, deliberate trail of fire over my thin t-shirt. I stopped breathing. The world narrowed to the feel of his hand, the oppressive scent of his cologne, the weight of his presence pinning me to the bed. "A perfect fit," he whispered, his breath warm against my ear. "You are a Covington, through and through. You will make this family proud. You will do what is necessary." His other hand came to rest on my knee, over the blanket. I was paralyzed, a trapped animal frozen in the headlights. The silence in the room was absolute, a roaring vacuum in my ears. I could hear my own blood pounding. And then I heard another sound. It was quiet, almost lost in the silence, but it was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was the click of the lock on my bedroom door. That was the sound of my childhood ending, the sound of the cage door being bolted from the inside. And the man holding the key was not a monster from a fairy tale. He was my grandfather, and he was smiling down at me as if he were bestowing a blessing. The morning after was unnervingly beautiful. Sunlight, thick and golden, poured through the lace curtains of my window, scattering dust motes into a glittering dance. Outside, a chorus of birds sang with cheerful indifference. The world had not stopped. It had not shuddered on its axis. It had simply woken up, just as it always did, leaving me behind in the wreckage of the night before. On my nightstand, the pearl necklace lay coiled like a pale, sleeping snake on the dark wood. I couldn't bring myself to touch it, yet I couldn't look away. It was a brand, a physical proof of the story my own body was now forced to keep. Getting out of bed was a monumental effort, a negotiation between my mind and limbs that didn't want to obey. Every joint ached with a deep phantom soreness. I moved through the quiet house like a trespasser, my bare feet silent on the cool, polished hardwood floors. The portraits of my ancestors hanging in the upstairs hall seemed to watch me with new eyes, their painted faces stern and accusatory. The house itself, once my home, now felt like a mausoleum, vast, cold, and filled with unspoken things. The silence was the worst part. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, weighted thing, thick with what was unsaid. It pressed in on my ears, a low hum of complicity. Breakfast was an exercise in torture. I sat at my designated place at the enormous mahogany dining table, staring at the perfect circle of the porcelain plate. The scent of coffee and bacon, usually a comforting aroma, turned my stomach. I picked up my fork and pushed a piece of scrambled egg from one side of the plate to the other. Michael was already there, hidden behind the rustling pages of the newspaper's sports section, oblivious. My father, David, sat to my right, his eyes fixed on the intricate pattern of the silverware. He cleared his throat twice but said nothing, his silence a confession of its own. He knew. Or if he didn't know everything, he knew enough to be terrified, and his terror made him a coward. My mother, Sarah, swept in, a vision in a silk dressing gown, her face a mask of bright morning cheer. "Good morning, everyone," she trilled, her eyes immediately landing on my plate. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Emma, darling, you're just picking at your food. Are we having one of our moods again?" The question was a weapon disguised as concern. It was designed to frame my distress as a personal failing, a teenage whim. "I'm not hungry," I mumbled, my gaze still on my plate. "Nonsense," she said lightly, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "You have to eat. You'll waste away. You know how it upsets your grandfather when the house isn't cheerful." She had, in one elegant motion, made my pain an inconvenience to him. Just then, he entered. Arthur Covington, dressed for the day in a crisp shirt and trousers, looked rested and vital. He smiled, a broad, benevolent smile that didn't reach his pale blue eyes. "Good morning," he boomed, his presence instantly filling the room, commanding its atmosphere. He took his seat at the head of the table. "Did you sleep well, Emma?" The question was a drop of poison in my ear. I felt my father flinch beside me. My mother's smile became fixed, brittle. I looked up, meeting his gaze for the first time that morning, and saw the flicker of cruel amusement there. He was playing a game, and I was the only other person who knew the rules. "Yes, thank you," I whispered. The lie felt like swallowing glass. The nights became a blur of managed terror. His visits became a silent ritual, the sound of his footsteps in the hall, a prelude to a darkness I couldn't fight. I learned to dissociate, to send my mind somewhere else while my body remained trapped in that pale blue room. I would fly out the window and over the manicured lawns of Harmony Creek, a silent observer in the sky. I would count the bricks on the wall, the threads in the lace curtains, anything to anchor my mind to something small and meaningless, to keep it from shattering completely. During the day, I became a ghost. I lost weight. Dark circles bloomed under my eyes like bruises. I flinched at sudden movements, at loud noises, at the touch of a hand on my shoulder, even my mother's. She noticed. Of course she noticed. Her response was not to ask, but to correct. "Emma, you're so jumpy lately. It's unladylike." Or, "For heaven's sake, can you stop moping? You're casting a pall over the entire house. Think of someone other than yourself for a change." Her words were a constant stream of low-grade denial, a refusal to acknowledge the screamingly obvious truth. To acknowledge it would be to acknowledge her own failure, and for a woman like my mother, that was an impossibility. Her comfort was more important than my safety. My last hope, a tiny flickering ember in the vast darkness of my despair, was my grandmother. Eleanor. She was the matriarch, the keeper of the Covington legacy. She was stern and cold, but I clung to the childish belief that beneath the icy exterior was a sense of justice, a core of decency that my mother lacked. She was a woman. Surely she would understand. Surely she would protect me. I waited for days, trying to build the courage, trying to find the right moment. I finally found her alone in the sunroom, a glass-enclosed space at the back of the house filled with ferns and orchids. She was sitting in a white wicker chair, her hands busy with a piece of needlepoint, the tiny needle rising and falling with meticulous, unwavering precision. The afternoon light illuminated the fine lines on her face, making her look like a sculpture carved from marble and ice. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. My palms were slick with sweat. I stood in the doorway for a long moment before she looked up, her eyes cool and appraising. "Emma, you're hovering," she said. Her voice was calm, without inflection. I took a hesitant step into the room. "Grandmother, can I talk to you?" She sighed, a barely audible puff of air, and set her needlepoint aside in her lap. She didn't invite me to sit. "What is it?" The words caught in my throat. I felt like a child again, small and powerless. It's about grandfather." Her expression did not change. Her face remained a placid, unreadable mask. "What about him?" The question was flat, forcing me to be the one to introduce the ugliness into her pristine, sun-drenched room. I stammered, my carefully rehearsed words deserting me. He comes to my room. At night. I couldn't say it. The shame was a physical thing, A hand clamped over my mouth. I looked at her, my eyes pleading for her to understand, to fill in the blanks, to save me from having to speak the unspeakable. She watched me struggle for a moment, her gaze unwavering. Then, she picked up her needlepoint again. The needle began to rise and fall, rise and fall. "In this family," she said, her voice as sharp and cold as the needle in her hand, "we do not entertain fantasies." The words struck me with the force of a physical blow. I swayed, grabbing the back of a nearby chair for support. "It's not a fantasy," I choked out. "It's the truth." She didn't look up. "Your grandfather is the man who provides for us all. He has built everything you see around you. Your mother's comfort, your brother's education, the very dress on your back, it all comes from him. Your duty as a Covington is to be grateful, not to be fanciful." The word fanciful was delivered with such dismissive contempt that it stole the air from my lungs. She was not just denying my reality, she was classifying it as a childish, hysterical lie. "You will leave this room," she continued, her voice dropping to a glacial whisper. "You will go upstairs and wash your face. You will come down to dinner and you will make pleasant conversation. You will maintain your composure, because that is what is expected of you. This conversation is over." In fact, it never happened. I stared at her, at the methodical rhythm of her hands, at the intricate pattern of flowers taking shape on the fabric. She was building a wall, stitch by stitch, between me and the truth, locking me on the outside. There was no flicker of doubt, no hint of compassion. There was only the cold, hard finality of her decree. I turned and walked out of the sunroom, my legs moving on their own accord. The final ember of hope inside me had been extinguished, smothered by her icy certainty. I climbed the grand staircase, each step heavier than the last. I had gone to the women of my family for salvation and had found only locked doors. My mother's silence was a form of denial. But my grandmother's was a command. It was the architect of the prison, the very sound of the bars clanging shut. And in that moment, I understood a truth more terrifying than the abuse itself. I was utterly and completely alone. The sound of silence was the only answer I would ever get. The days that followed my grandmother's decree were a study in gray. The world, which had once held color and warmth, now seemed washed out, as if I were viewing it through a pane of dusty glass. I moved through the grand rooms of my house on a current of routine, my body performing the necessary actions of living, waking, dressing, eating, sleeping, while my mind floated in a numb, foggy detachment. The abuse continued, a relentless, silent tide that pulled me under each night and spat me out, gasping, into the false light of morning. The house was no longer a home. It was a map of hostile territories and potential ambushes. The long upstairs hallway was a gauntlet. A closed door was a threat. His smile at the dinner table was a silent, gloating victory. In this cold war of silence, my father was a neutral territory that had been ceded to the enemy. He was a man defined by absences, an absence of conviction, an absence of courage, an absence of will. He existed only in relation to my grandfather. He dressed like him, adopted his turns of phrase, mirrored his opinions on politics and business. But it was a hollow echo. Where my grandfather was a roaring fire of charisma and control, my father was a puff of smoke, easily dispersed by the slightest wind. And the wind in our house always blew from the direction of Arthur Covington. I had abandoned all hope of rescue from my mother or grandmother. They were the architects of the cage. But my father was different. His weakness, the very quality I had always resented, now seemed like a potential crack in the fortress wall. He was afraid. I could see it in the way he avoided my eyes, in the nervous tremor in his hands when my grandfather spoke to me, in the way he would abruptly leave a room if we were left alone in it together. He was afraid of his own father, but maybe, just maybe, he was also afraid for me. That sliver of possibility, born not of hope but of sheer, bottomless desperation, was all I had left. The opportunity came on a Tuesday afternoon, heavy with the threat of a thunderstorm. The air was thick and still. I saw him from the top of the stairs, disappearing into his study, the one room in the house that was exclusively his. It was his sanctuary, the place he went to pretend he was the man he was supposed to be. In a moment of pure impulse, a lurch of my gut that bypassed all rational thought, I followed him. His study was at the end of the west wing, a room paneled in dark cherry wood. Bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes of history, philosophy, and classic literature. It smelled of old paper and lemon polish. It was a room designed to project intelligence and gravitas, but I knew the truth. I had never once in my entire life seen my father read one of those books. Their spines were perfect, uncreased. They were props, just like the heavy, ornate desk and the green banker's lamp that cast a solemn glow on its polished surface. The whole room was a lie, and he was its curator. He was standing by the window, his back to the door, staring out at the darkening sky. He didn't hear me enter. "Dad!" My voice was a croak. He jumped, startled, and spun around. His face, when he saw me, was a canvas of alarm. "Emma, what are you doing in here? You know I don't like to be disturbed." "We need to talk," I said, my voice gaining a sliver of strength. I closed the heavy door behind me, the sound echoing in the quiet room. The click of the latch felt significant, trapping us both inside with the truth. He looked at the closed door, then back at me, his expression turning to one of wary dread. "Talk about what?" he asked, but his eyes told me he already knew. I walked towards the desk, using it as a barrier between us. The tears I had been holding back for days began to well up, hot and fast. "He's hurting me," I whispered, the words ragged, torn from my throat. "Grandfather, he comes to my room. He hurts me." My father stared at me, his face pale. His first reaction was not concern, it was fear. He glanced nervously at the door, as if my grandfather might materialize on the other side. "Emma, stop this," he hissed, his voice a low, frantic whisper. "Stop it right now." "Don't say these things. It's true." My own voice rose, sharp with hysteria. "You know it's true. I see it in your face." "You know something is wrong. You won't look at me anymore. You won't even talk to me." "That's not true," he lied, his eyes darting around the room, anywhere but at me. "Yes, it is." I slammed my hand on the desk, the sound making him flinch. "He comes to my room at night. He locks the door." "Dad, please. You have to do something. You have to make him stop." I was sobbing now, great heaving gasps that tore through my body. I was laying my soul bare on the polished surface of his desk, offering him the ugliest, most painful truth I possessed, begging him to take it, to do something with it. For a long moment, he just stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish gasping for air. I saw the flicker of conflict in his eyes, a brief, agonizing war between his conscience and his terror. And then, I watched his terror win. His fear curdled into anger, a pathetic defensive rage that was easier for him to manage than shame. "How dare you?" he finally spat, his voice trembling. "How dare you come in here and say these vile things about my father?" "They're not lies," I cried. "They are," he roared, finding his voice at last. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "You are lying. Do you have any idea what you are saying? What you are accusing him of? Do you want to destroy this family? Is that it? After everything he has done for us, for you? You want to tear it all down with these sick, twisted fantasies?" He was using their words now, their fantasies, the family script. He had learned his lines well. The hope inside me, that last desperate flicker, died, and a cold, heavy calm settled in its place. The tears stopped. I just watched him. I saw him not as my father, but as a weak, terrified man, lashing out because he was trapped. He was as much a prisoner of my grandfather as I was, just in a different kind of cage. But that knowledge didn't bring me comfort. It brought only contempt. "He is my father," David said, his voice dropping, taking on a tone of grim finality as he delivered the death blow to my last hope. "He is the head of this house, and you will not speak of him this way." Not to me, not to anyone, ever. He was choosing his father. He was choosing the lie. He was choosing the silence. In that moment, he was sacrificing his daughter on the altar of his own cowardice. I didn't say another word. I just looked at him, letting my silence speak for me. I let him see the ruin he had just endorsed. He couldn't hold my gaze. He looked away, turning back toward the window, toward the coming storm. "Go to your room, Emma," he said, his voice quiet now, exhausted. "We will never speak of this again. Do you understand me? Never." I understood. I understood everything. I turned and walked out of the study, my back straight, my head held high. I didn't slam the door. I closed it softly behind me. The quiet click of the latch was a final deafening sound. It was the sound of the last door in the world closing. It was the sound of a father's betrayal, a sound far more terrible than a monster's footsteps in the hall. Because this time, the person who had locked me in the dark was the one who was supposed to be my protector. I was no longer just a prisoner in my grandfather's house. I was an enemy of the state, and my own father had just signed my sentence. After my father closed the door on me, the world went quiet. It wasn't the menacing, watchful quiet from before. It was a dead silence, the kind that follows an extinction. I had exhausted all my appeals. I had presented my case to every court in my small, isolated country of a family, and the verdict from each judge had been a unanimous, resounding guilty. Guilty of lying. Guilty of being dramatic. Guilty of threatening the peace. My punishment was to be erased. I became a ghost in my own home, a phantom that drifted from room to room, seen but not acknowledged. At the dinner table, conversations flowed around me as if my chair were empty. My mother would ask Michael about his classes, my father would discuss stock prices with my grandfather, my grandmother would comment on the flower arrangements, and I would sit in the vacuum of their voices, a black hole of silence. The nights continued their grim rhythm, but even they lost their sharp edges of terror, worn down by repetition into a dull, chronic ache of inevitability. I had perfected the art of leaving my own body, of turning my mind into a blank, white space where nothing could touch me. I was a shell, and I was surviving. That's what I told myself. Summer bled into a sweltering late August, then gave way to the first hints of autumn. The impossibly green leaves on the oak tree outside my window began to tinge with yellow and rust. The days grew shorter, the evenings cooler. I watched the seasons turn with a detached sort of wonder, marking time not by the calendar, but by the slow death of the world outside my window. It felt fitting. The change, when it came, was not emotional. I had no emotions left to give. It was physical. It began as a subtle wrongness, a low-level hum of disharmony in my body, a wave of nausea in the morning that I would swallow down, blaming the richness of the dinner the night before, a profound weariness that settled deep in my bones, making the climb up the grand staircase feel like scaling a mountain. I was a stranger in my own skin, and some new, unwelcome tenant was beginning to rearrange the furniture. Then came the realization, a cold, clinical observation that pierced through the fog of my numbness. I counted the days on the calendar in my head, then counted them again. I was late. A week at first, then 2. The small, cold stone of anxiety that had been dormant in my gut for months began to stir. This was a new kind of fear, a primal, biological dread that had nothing to do with footsteps in the hall or the click of a lock. This was a fear that was growing inside me. The need to know became an obsession, the only focused thought I'd had in months. But I was a prisoner. I had no money of my own that my mother didn't track, no freedom to walk to the town pharmacy. The walls of the Covington estate, once a symbol of prestige, had become the walls of my own private panopticon. An opportunity, when it came, was wrapped in the bitter irony of my mother's performative concern. One evening, as I pushed a piece of chicken around my plate, she eyed me with a critical frown. "Emma, you look positively skeletal. You're as pale as a sheet. Honestly, it's embarrassing." She turned to my father. "David, we simply must get some iron supplements into her, and B vitamins. She looks unwell." The next afternoon, my mother drove me into town. It was the first time I'd left the property in what felt like a lifetime. The world outside the car window looked strange and hyper-real. Sitting in the passenger seat, with her chattering on about the Abernathy's new boat, was a surreal form of torture. At the Harmony Creek Pharmacy, she consulted at length with Mr. Henderson, the pharmacist, about the best brand of vitamins for a sensitive, moody teenager. Her distraction was my only chance. In my pocket, my fingers were curled around a $20 bill I had found in the pocket of an old winter coat months ago and hidden away. My heart hammered against my ribs as I slipped away down an aisle marked Family Planning. The boxes were a garish collection of pinks and purples, promising certainty and early results. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grasp the small rectangular box. I walked, my legs feeling like lead, to the front counter where a young girl who couldn't have been much older than me was working. I put the box down, along with a tube of lip balm to serve as a decoy. I avoided her gaze, paid with my crumpled bill, and shoved the small paper bag deep into my purse just as my mother called my name. Back in my room, I waited until I knew the house was settled, until my mother was on the phone in her sitting room and my father was in his study of lies. The small paper bag felt as heavy as a bomb. I crept into my ensuite bathroom, the only room in the house with a lock I controlled, and clicked it shut. The bathroom was a cold, sterile cavern of white and gray marble. My reflection in the vast, gilt-edged mirror was a stranger, a pale, haunted-looking girl with eyes that were too big for her face. I looked like a ghost already. I took the box out of the bag. My hands trembled as I tore it open, the crinkling of the plastic wrapper sounding as loud as a fire alarm in the stillness. I read the clinical instructions printed on the thin paper insert, my mind struggling to focus on the diagrams and the timelines. Place on a flat surface. Wait 3 minutes. 1 line for negative, 2 lines for positive. I did as it said. The 3 minutes that followed were the longest of my life. I didn't sit. I paced the cold marble floor, a caged animal in a 3 by 3 meter space. I prayed to a God I no longer believed in, a frantic, bargaining prayer. Please, no. Anything but this. I'll do anything. Please. Denial washed over me. It was stress. My mother was right. I was just a moody teenager with an irregular cycle. It was nothing. Then came the wave of grim resignation. Of course. Of course this would happen. This was the final, perfect, inescapable consequence. This was the punchline to the cruel joke my life had become. My eyes fell on my watch. 3 minutes. I walked back to the counter, my feet cold on the marble. I felt strangely calm, the way a person does when they have accepted their own execution. I looked down. There was 1 line. A single, bold, blue line in the control window. Relief, so potent and overwhelming it almost brought me to my knees, surged through me. It was a mistake. I was wrong. It was all in my head. A sob of pure, unadulterated joy escaped my lips. But then, as I watched, something else began to happen. Like a ghost materializing from a fog, a second line began to form in the results window. It was faint at first, a pale, watery smudge. But it was there, and it was growing darker, more certain, more absolute with every passing second. It was not a faint line. It was not ambiguous. It was a sharp, clear, undeniable line of damning blue. 2 lines. The plastic stick slipped from my numb fingers and clattered onto the marble floor. The sound was small, insignificant, but it was the sound of my world ending for the second time. I sank to the floor, my back against the cold porcelain of the bathtub, and wrapped my arms around myself. I didn't scream. The sound was trapped in my throat, a solid ball of pure, undiluted terror. This wasn't just a secret I had to keep. This was a living, breathing secret. A part of him, now a part of me. It was a parasite. It was a time bomb. My body was no longer my own. It was a vessel for my own trauma, a walking, talking crime scene. The silence I had been forced to keep, the silence my family had demanded, was about to become physically impossible. The walls of my prison had just collapsed inwards, and the cage was no longer the house. It was my own body. The 2 blue lines on the plastic stick did not create panic. Panic is a hot, frantic emotion, and I had been living in the cold for so long that I was no longer capable of it. What I felt instead was a grim, terrifying clarity. The fog of numbness that had enveloped my mind for months was burned away, not by a ray of hope, but by the stark, clinical certainty of my situation. A secret of the mind can be buried. A secret of the flesh cannot. It grows. It announces itself. The silent psychological warfare I had been waging was about to become a physical, undeniable fact. My body was now a clock, and it was ticking. For days, I carried this knowledge like a stone inside me. I watched my family across the dinner table, their faces oblivious, their conversations trivial. They spoke of the stock market, of a charity gala, of Michael's chances of getting into his first-choice university. They were living in a world that was about to be shattered, and they had no idea. The power dynamic had subtly shifted. I was no longer just their silent victim. I was the keeper of a truth that could obliterate their perfect, curated world. The question was no longer if the bomb would go off, but when. I knew I could not let them discover it on their terms. I could picture it clearly: a fainting spell, a doctor's visit arranged by my mother, a quiet, clinical confirmation that would allow them to control the narrative from the start. They would whisk me away in the night before I had a chance to speak. No, I had been silenced for too long. If I was going down, I would go down in a pillar of fire, and I would make damn sure they were all there to witness the explosion. I would not give them the comfort of handling my problem quietly. I would force them to look at it, to look at me, to look at him. I chose the venue for my detonation with care. The formal dining room. It was the family's central stage, the place where the performance of the happy, powerful Covingtons was most acute. It was a room of heavy drapery, polished silver, and hushed tones. It was perfect. That evening, I sat at the table and said nothing. I ate my food slowly, methodically. I could feel their eyes on me. My silence was different tonight. It wasn't the cowed, empty silence they were used to. It was a coiled, watchful silence, heavy with intent. My mother was telling a story about a squabble at her book club. My father was nodding along. Michael was complaining about a professor. My grandfather was swirling the wine in his glass, a smug, satisfied look on his face. I waited for a pause, a brief intake of breath in the flow of their meaningless chatter. The moment came. The room fell quiet for a single, expectant second. "I have something to tell you," I said. My voice was not loud, but it cut through the air like a shard of glass. 5 heads turned towards me, 5 pairs of eyes, all fixed on the ghost who had just spoken. The surprise on their faces was almost comical. I took a slow, deliberate breath. I looked past my mother's worried frown, past my father's nervous glance, past my brother's annoyed sigh. I looked directly at my grandfather. "I'm pregnant." The words landed on the table with the force of a physical blow. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her chest. My father's face went slack, the color draining from it. Michael just stared, his mouth slightly agape. My grandmother's fork paused halfway to her lips. Only Arthur's expression remained unchanged, his eyes narrowed slightly, a beat of pure, stunned silence. Before any of them could react, before the shock could curdle into a pre-planned response, I played my final card. I raised my hand, my finger trembling slightly, and I pointed it directly at the head of the table. And it's his. The tribunal commenced immediately. There was no chaotic shouting, no emotional breakdown. That was not the Covington way. What followed was a cold, systematic, and utterly brutal dismantling of my truth. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Arthur was the first to recover. He did not deny it with anger. He reacted with a sigh, a sound of profound, weary disappointment. He carefully placed his fork and knife on his plate, crossing them neatly. "Emma," he said, his voice laced with a pained sort of pity. He didn't look at me. He looked at the others, drawing them into his circle of sanity, casting me out. "The girl is unwell. We have all seen it. This is a cry for help." My mother seized on his cue, her shock instantly transforming into righteous public shame. Her face was a mask of horror, but not for me, for herself. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice shaking with rage. "How could you sit at this table, in this house, and tell such a disgusting, filthy lie?" Her eyes were wild. "Who was it, Emma? Some boy from town? Some stable hand you've been sneaking around with? You little slut?" To think you would try to blame your own grandfather for your cheap little mistake." "She's lost her mind," Michael chimed in, leaning back in his chair with an air of clinical superiority. He looked at our parents. "It's obvious. She's doing this for attention. She's always been dramatic. She needs a doctor. A psychiatrist. She's clearly unstable." In 3 swift moves, I had been redefined. I was not a victim. I was insane, I was a slut, and I was a liar. Throughout it all, my father said nothing. He stared at his plate as if it held the secrets to the universe. His knuckles were white where he gripped his water glass. His silence was his testimony. It was a plea of no contest. It was his consent. Finally, my grandmother, Eleanor, acted. She had watched the entire exchange with the detached interest of a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. Now she calmly folded her linen napkin and placed it beside her plate. It was a gesture of finality. The performance was over. She turned her icy gaze on me. "This family," she began, her voice low and devoid of all emotion, "has survived civil wars, economic depressions, and the ceaseless march of time. And it has survived for one reason. We have always understood the paramount importance of our good name. We have always understood the meaning of honor." Her eyes swept over me with a look of such profound contempt it made my skin feel cold. "You," she said, the word dripping with venom, "have brought a whore's shame into this house. You have dragged the Covington name through the gutter with your pathetic, sick fantasies. You have created a problem." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle into the dead air of the room. She looked around the table, at her son, her husband, her grandchildren, her eyes coming to rest on me last. "And like all problems in this family," she concluded, her voice dropping to a chilling whisper, "it will be handled." The word hung in the air, a naked threat. Handled. It was a sterile, corporate word, a word one uses for a pest infestation or a hostile takeover. It was not a word one uses for their own granddaughter and the child she was carrying. I had walked into the room thinking I was holding a bomb. I realized now that I had only been holding a lit match, and I had just handed it to a family of arsonists. They had taken my truth, my last weapon, and had turned it against me, reforging it into the justification for my own destruction. I was no longer a person. I was a problem. And as I looked at the 5 cold, determined faces staring back at me, I knew, with a certainty that froze my soul, that the Covington family always solved its problems. The word "handled" hung in the dining room long after they had all departed, a poisonous vapor that contaminated the very air I breathed. I was not dismissed from the table. I was left there, alone, a centerpiece of shame amidst the cooling dinner plates and half-empty wine glasses. After what felt like an eternity, my brother Michael re-entered the room. He did not look at me. He simply stood by the door and said, "Get up. Go to your room." His voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. It was the voice of a stranger delivering an order. I rose on shaky legs, my body moving with a strange, disconnected autonomy. He walked behind me up the grand staircase, a silent, menacing guard. He followed me to my bedroom door, stopping as I crossed the threshold. I turned to look at him, a desperate last-ditch appeal to the boy who I had once built forts with in the garden. There was nothing there. His face was a cold, blank slate. He pulled the door shut, and I heard the unmistakable, final sound of a key turning in the lock from the outside. My room, once my only sanctuary, had become my cell. The first 24 hours were a blur of suspended time. I paced the floor, from the window to the door, back and forth, a 4-walled cage. I tested the door handle 100 times, knowing it was useless, but needing the physical confirmation of my imprisonment. Meals appeared on a tray left on the floor outside my door, announced by a sharp rap of knuckles. It was the kind of detached care one might give to a quarantined animal. The next afternoon, the key turned again. My mother and my grandmother entered. They did not enter as family coming to comfort or to reason. They entered as a delegation, their faces set in masks of grim, corporate resolve. My mother, Sarah, wouldn't meet my eyes, her gaze fixed on a point just over my shoulder. My grandmother, Eleanor, looked directly at me, her eyes as cold and hard as river stones. She was the one who spoke. "We have finalized the arrangements," she said, her voice as crisp and starched as the collar on her blouse. "There are, of course, certain practicalities to consider, certain appearances to maintain." I stood before them, my arms wrapped around my waist, a silent, waiting defendant. "An abortion," she said, the word distasteful on her tongue, "is out of the question. Your grandfather is a public opponent of the practice. It would be an unacceptable hypocrisy. Furthermore, the risk of a doctor, a nurse, the risk of the truth becoming public is one we will not take." The logic was so perverse, so twisted, it was almost brilliant. They would not commit a sin they could be caught for. Their public morality was a shield for their private monstrosity. My mother finally spoke, her voice thin and reedy. "So we have found a better solution." A compassionate one. She was trying to convince herself as much as me. "There is a private care facility in the northern part of the state, a lovely, quiet place in the country. They are very discreet. They specialize in helping young women in your delicate condition. You will be taken there next week," Eleanor continued, her tone cutting through my mother's flimsy euphemisms. "You will remain there for the duration of your term. You will have the child. After the birth, the facility will handle the placement." Placement. Another sterile, bloodless word for a stolen baby. My mind reeled. They were going to let me carry this child, this living embodiment of my trauma, for 6 more months, only to tear it away from me at the end. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. "After the placement is complete," Eleanor said, her gaze pinning me in place, "you will be given a sum of money, enough to start a new life, elsewhere. You will not return to Harmony Creek. You will not attempt to contact this family. You will not, under any circumstances, use the Covington name again. As of this moment, you are no longer our granddaughter." She glanced at my mother. My mother took a shaky breath and delivered her line. "You are no longer my daughter." She finally looked at me, and her eyes were not filled with hate, but with a terrifying, hollow emptiness. She had already erased me. "You are a loose end, Emma, and we are tying you off." As my grandmother laid out the terms of my exile, my mother began to move around the room. It was a slow, systematic dismantling of my life. She unplugged my phone from the wall. She took the small laptop from my desk. She went to my bookshelf and began to pull down my favorite books, the ones with the worn spines, the worlds I escaped into. She took the small silver frame from my nightstand that held a picture of me and Michael as children. Each item she took was a memory, a connection, a piece of my identity. She was not just packing things away. She was stripping my cell, ensuring the prisoner had no tools, no history, no hope. I watched her, paralyzed. A silent scream was building in my chest, but I had no air to let it out. They were not just casting me out. They were unwriting me from their history, turning my chapter in the family saga into a blank page. When she was done, she had a small box of my life in her hands. My mother, the archivist of my own erasure. "This is not a negotiation," Eleanor said, her voice a final cold nail in the coffin of my former life. "This is the solution. It is the only way to cure the sickness you have brought into this house. It is merciful." Merciful. The word was a desecration. They turned and walked to the door. My mother did not look back. My grandmother paused on the threshold and gave me one last, lingering look. There was no pity in her eyes, no remorse. There was only the grim satisfaction of a problem solved. "The Covington cure," she said softly, as if naming a patented process. Then she closed the door. The key turned in the lock one last time. I was left standing in the center of my room, a room that was no longer mine, stripped bare of everything that had made it so. They had taken my past and my future. They had taken my name. All I had left was the monstrous secret growing in the dark, silent space inside me. The cure wasn't about my well-being. The cure was my complete and total annihilation. The week I spent waiting in my empty room was a different kind of prison. The acute terror had subsided, replaced by the dull, hollow ache of resignation. I was a condemned prisoner on death row, my execution date set, with nothing to do but watch the sun rise and set through the bars of my window. Time became a thick, syrupy thing, stretching and slowing. I slept for long, dreamless hours, a merciful escape into nothingness. When I was awake, I would trace the patterns in the wood grain of the floor or count the water stains on the ceiling. I was disassociating from my own life, preparing for my own erasure. I was already gone. The physical departure was just a formality. The summons came, as I knew it would, in the dead of night. I was startled from a shallow sleep not by a knock, but by the sound of the key scraping in the lock. The door swung open, and the man standing there was a complete stranger. He was large and thick-set, with a blank, impassive face. He wasn't wearing a uniform, just a plain dark jacket, which somehow made him more menacing. He didn't speak. He just jerked his head towards the hallway, a silent, indisputable command. There was nothing to pack. The clothes I wore, a pair of simple jeans and a gray sweatshirt they had left for me, were all I had. I followed him out of the room, my bare feet cold on the floorboards. The house was dark, steeped in the deep, heavy silence of 3 a.m. We moved like ghosts through the familiar spaces, down the grand staircase where I had descended in fine dresses for garden parties, through the cavernous foyer where the great Covington family portraits hung in shadow, their eyes seeming to follow my shameful exit. It was a funeral procession for a life that had already died. Another man was waiting by the front door, a leaner, more wiry version of the first. He held the door open, his face just as devoid of expression. They were a matched set of undertakers, there to transport the corpse of Emma Covington away from the pristine family home. They were not unkind, but their professional indifference was a special kind of cruelty. I was not a girl to them. I was not even a person. I was cargo, a package to be delivered to a specific address. The man behind me gave me a slight, impersonal nudge forward, out of the house and into the night. A damp, cool wind immediately wrapped around me, carrying the scent of rain. And then the rain began to fall, not a storm, but a cold, steady drizzle that felt like the sky itself was weeping for me. At the end of the long, curving driveway, a car was waiting. It was a large, black sedan, its engine idling with a low, patient rumble. Its headlights cut 2 sharp cones through the misty rain, illuminating the path of my exile. It was completely anonymous, without markings, a vehicle designed for secrets and disappearances. As the first man opened the back door for me, a strange, powerful impulse made me stop. I turned and looked back at the house one last time. It stood there, a great white behemoth against the dark sky, its windows like vacant eyes. And then I saw them. Up on the second floor, in the large window of my grandparents' master suite, the curtains were parted. 4 figures stood there, their faces pale ovals in the dim light from within. Arthur, Eleanor. My mother, Sarah, my father, David, they were all there. They were watching me go. They were not waving. There were no tears, no gestures of farewell. They stood perfectly still, like statues, their faces impassive, unreadable stone. They were simply bearing witness to the final step of their solution, ensuring the problem was well and truly removed. The last image I would ever have of my family was of them standing together in the dark, watching me disappear into the rain. I got into the car. The door closed with a heavy, solid thud, sealing me inside. The interior smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap pine air freshener. The upholstery was damp and cool against my skin. The 2 men got into the front seats, and the car began to roll forward, its tires crunching softly on the wet gravel. No one spoke. The only sounds were the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers and the hum of the engine. We drove down the long driveway, past the manicured lawns, and my grandmother's now sleeping rose garden. We turned onto the quiet, empty streets of Harmony Creek. We passed the town square with its sleeping fountain, the darkened storefronts, the tall, silent steeple of the Presbyterian church. I pressed my face against the cool, rain-streaked glass, trying to burn every familiar shape into my memory, saying 1,000 silent goodbyes. This town was the only world I had ever known, and it was sliding past my window like a dream I was waking from. Soon, the last of the streetlights fell away, and the car merged onto the dark, empty highway. The blackness outside the window was absolute, broken only by the fleeting reflection of our own headlights on the wet asphalt. I was heading north, into a future as black and unknown as the road ahead. I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes, a single cold tear finally escaping and tracing a path down my cheek. They had done it. They had won. They had snuffed me out. They didn't just cast me out. They erased me. They thought that by sending me into the dark, my story would end. They had no idea it was just the beginning. The journey north was a descent into a black, featureless void. I slept in fits and starts, my head bumping against the cold glass of the window. When the car finally slowed and turned off the highway, the first gray, watery light of dawn was seeping into the sky, revealing a landscape of bleak, rolling hills and skeletal winter trees. We drove down a long, unpaved road, the car bucking and groaning over ruts and potholes. And then I saw it. It was not the lovely, quiet place in the country my mother had described. It was a looming 3-story brick building, stained with age and neglect, its windows narrow slits that looked more like a prison's than a home's. A faded, peeling sign near the entrance read, "St. Jude's Home for Wayward Girls." The irony was a physical blow. St. Jude, the patron saint of lost causes. I was officially a lost cause. My 2 silent escorts led me to the front door and knocked. It was opened by a woman who seemed to be carved from granite. She was tall and thin, dressed in a starched white uniform that looked like a relic from another era. Her gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her face was a roadmap of disapproving lines. "We have a delivery for Mrs. Gable," one of the men said. "I am Mrs. Gable?" the woman replied, her voice as starched as her uniform. She looked me up and down, a flicker of cold appraisal in her eyes. "She'll do." "You can go." The men handed her an envelope, turned, and walked back to their car, without a single word or glance in my direction. They had delivered the package. Their job was done. As the black sedan disappeared down the dirt road, Mrs. Gable gripped my arm with surprising strength and pulled me inside. "Welcome to St. Jude's," she said, her voice devoid of any welcome at all. "You will learn our rules. The first is silence." The months that followed were a waking nightmare, a monotonous loop of gray days lived out in hushed misery. The place smelled of disinfectant, boiled cabbage, and despair. There were perhaps a dozen other girls there, all of us with the same haunted, vacant look in our eyes. We were not wayward. We were just young, scared, and trapped. We were forbidden from speaking to one another about our pasts, a rule designed to foster isolation. We performed chores, scrubbing floors, peeling potatoes, folding laundry, in a haze of silent drudgery. I withdrew into myself completely. My entire world, my entire focus, narrowed to the life growing inside me. In the dead of night, in my small, cold room with its single iron-framed bed, I would lie with my hands on my belly and talk to him. I told him stories. I promised him that somehow, someday, I would get us out of there. I promised him a life of sunshine and laughter, a life far away from the shadows of the Covingtons and the cold walls of St. Jude's. His kicks and flutters were my only real connection to the world, the only proof that I was not entirely alone. He was my secret, my hope, the tiny, fierce lion heart beating in the darkness. When the labor began, it was violent and swift. I was moved to a room they called the infirmary, which was just another cold, sterile room with a metal bed and a glaring overhead light. There was no comfort, no kindness, no hand to hold. Mrs. Gable and a silent, sour-faced nurse were the only ones present. They treated the birth not as a miracle, but as an inconvenient and messy biological process to be managed with grim efficiency. "Push, Mrs. Gable would command, her voice sharp. "Don't make so much noise," the nurse would snap when I cried out. I was an animal in a stall, and they were the impatient farmers. After hours of agonizing, isolating pain, he was born, his first furious cry cutting through the sterile silence of the room. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. They cleaned him quickly, wrapped him in a thin white blanket, and for a few precious, stolen moments, they placed him in my arms. He was so small, so perfect, He had a dusting of dark hair, and his tiny, wrinkled face was a furious red. I looked at him and felt a love so fierce and overwhelming it eclipsed everything else. The pain, the fear, the Covingtons, the betrayal. None of it mattered. Only he mattered. I touched his tiny, curled fingers and whispered the name I had chosen for him, a name of strength and courage. "Leo," I murmured, my tears finally falling, baptizing his forehead. "My little lion." "That's enough," Mrs. Gable said, her voice breaking the sacred spell. "He needs to be checked by the doctor. You need to rest." She took him from my arms. I was too weak, too exhausted, too submerged in the new, overwhelming love to protest. I watched her carry my son out of the room, my heart swelling with a hope so pure it was painful. We had made it. He was here. He was real. The next day passed in a delirious, happy haze. I waited for them to bring Leo back to me, but they said I was still too weak, that he needed to be monitored. I accepted it. I trusted them. It was the last time I would ever trust anyone. That evening, Mrs. Gable entered my room. She was not carrying my baby. Her face was set in a mask of practiced, professional sympathy. "I'm sorry to have to tell you," she began, her voice flat. "The baby had complications, a weakness in his lungs. He was very small, very frail. He didn't make it through the night. The world did not go black. It went white." A searing, silent, soundless explosion of pure white nothingness that vaporized my entire being. My mind simply refused to process the words. It couldn't be true. I had held him. He was perfect. He was my lion. Lions are not weak. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. A sound came out of my mouth, a horrible, guttural animal noise of a creature whose soul has been ripped out. The white nothingness collapsed into a black hole of grief so absolute and crushing that I could not breathe. My son was gone. The only good, pure thing in my life had been created and then stolen away in the span of 24 hours. I spent the next week in that black hole. I didn't eat. I didn't speak. I lay in my bed, facing the wall, waiting for the world to end. On the 7th day, Mrs. Gable came for me. "You're recovered," she announced. "It's time for you to leave." She led me to the front door, the same one I had entered what felt like a lifetime ago. She pushed a thin white envelope into my hand. "Your benefactors have fulfilled their financial obligation. This should be enough for a bus ticket and a fresh start. You are not to return here. You are not to speak of this place or anyone you met here. Do you understand?" I nodded, a numb, mechanical gesture. She opened the door and propelled me out into the gray afternoon. I was left standing on the side of the same dusty, unpaved road, alone. The envelope contained $500. I stood there for a long time, the wind whipping my hair around my face. I was nothing. A hollowed-out shell. A ghost haunting the side of a road to nowhere. This was what they wanted. This was the Covington cure. They had taken my child, my name, my past. They had left me with nothing but a grief so vast it should have killed me. And maybe it should have. But as I stood there, shivering in the cold, something else stirred in the black void where my heart used to be. It was a tiny, hard kernel of something I hadn't felt in a long time. It was rage. A cold, quiet, diamond-hard rage. They thought they had erased me. They thought they had won. They had left me for dead, but I was still breathing, and in that moment, I made a choice. Surviving would no longer be a passive state of existence. It would be an act of rebellion. It would be my life's sole purpose. I would live, if only to spite them. I would disappear into the world, just as they'd planned, but I would not be erased. I would endure. It was the only way I could defile their perfect, tidy solution. I would survive their cure. The $500 in the envelope was not a fresh start. It was a gag order. It was the price of my silence, the final payment for my erasure. I stood on that dusty roadside for what felt like an hour, the world a meaningless blur of passing cars. I was 19 years old, though I felt ancient. I had no past and no future. I was a ghost, and my first act as a spectral being was to choose a direction. At a grimy bus station in a town whose name I never learned, I looked at the departures board, a list of places that meant nothing to me. I bought a one-way ticket to Atlanta. It was in Georgia, but it was a city, vast and anonymous. It was the perfect place for a ghost to disappear. Those first years are a montage of exhaustion and fear in my memory. I became a waitress in a 24-hour diner, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and a permanent smell of stale coffee and grease. I learned to smile for tips, to balance 3 plates on one arm, to ignore the casual cruelty and clumsy advances of strangers. I lived in a series of rented rooms in boarding houses, places that smelled of damp and other people's lonely lives. I slept with a chair wedged under the doorknob, my ears attuned to every creak in the hallway. The Covingtons had taught me that monsters looked like family. The world taught me they could look like anyone. One sweltering afternoon, in the basement of a county courthouse, Emma Covington officially died. I paid a man I met through another waitress $200 for a tattered birth certificate belonging to his cousin, who had died in infancy. With that flimsy piece of paper and a story I rehearsed 100 times about a lost wallet and a house fire, I walked into the DMV. An hour later, I walked out with a state ID card that had my picture on it. The name read Grace Miller. I stared at it, at the stranger who was me, Grace. A name so far removed from my reality it felt like a cosmic joke. But Grace Miller had no past, no family, no ghosts. Grace Miller was safe. But every night, Emma Covington returned. The grief for Leo was a physical presence, a phantom limb that ached with a pain no medicine could touch. I would be pouring coffee and see a young mother with a baby, and the ceramic pot would tremble in my hand. I'd have to retreat to the staff bathroom, my hand clamped over my mouth to stifle the sob that threatened to tear me apart. The nightmares were the worst. I would be back in that cold white room, holding him, feeling his warmth, only to have him snatched from my arms by the granite-faced Mrs. Gable. I would wake up with my arms aching, empty, the name Leo a silent scream on my lips. The turning point came on a freezing winter day about 2 years in. I stepped into the Atlanta Central Library simply to escape the biting wind. The moment I walked through the doors, the cacophony of the city street fell away, replaced by a profound, cathedral-like silence. The air smelled of old paper and binding glue, a scent of stored knowledge and quiet contemplation. Rows upon rows of shelves stood like silent sleeping soldiers, each one guarding 1,000 different worlds. For the first time since I had left Harmony Creek, I felt my shoulders, which had been permanently hunched in a state of high alert, begin to relax. It was safe here. It was orderly. Nothing bad could happen in a library. That day, I sat at a carrel in the back and cried, not the racking sobs of grief, but quiet, tired tears of relief. I had found a sanctuary. The library became my home. I started by studying for my GED, hiding in the nonfiction stacks. Then I enrolled in night classes at a community college, my waitress tips paying for tuition one textbook at a time. I got a job at the library, first as a page, shelving books, my hands finding comfort in the simple, tactile work of putting stories back in their rightful place. 18 years passed like a ghost. The world outside changed. The music, the technology, the politics, it all shifted and evolved. But my inner world remained frozen. I eventually earned a degree in library science. I moved from the boarding house to a small, clean, one-bedroom apartment that I kept meticulously neat. My life had a rhythm, a quiet order that I clung to. I was Grace Miller, the soft-spoken, reliable librarian at the reference desk. I was good at my job. I could find a citation for a doctoral thesis or recommend a fantasy series to a teenager with the same calm, detached competence. My colleagues were kind, but they knew not to pry. I was a closed book. They would invite me out for drinks, and I would politely decline. Men would ask me on dates, and I would refuse with a gentle firmness that left no room for argument. Trust was a foreign country I had no passport for. How could I explain the vast, barren landscape of my past to someone? How could I let anyone get close enough to see the ghost of the girl named Emma, to feel the cold draft of her unending sorrow? The risk was too great. Solitude was my fortress, and I guarded its walls fiercely. I never looked back. I never Googled the Covington name. I never read the society pages of the Atlanta paper, terrified I might see a picture of my mother at a charity ball or my brother in a business section profile. Harmony Creek and the family who resided there were a cancerous tumor I had managed to excise. I knew that even looking at a picture, reading a single sentence, would be like allowing the poison to seep back into my carefully constructed, sterile life. And so, at 36 years old, I was a survivor. I had kept the vow I made to myself on that dusty road. I had not let them destroy me. I had built a life, but it was a half-life, a life lived in monochrome. I was a ghost haunting the quiet, orderly existence of Grace Miller. The grief for my son had not faded with time. It had simply settled, becoming a permanent part of my soul, a constant, low-grade ache that was as much a part of me as the beating of my own heart. I had survived, yes. But I was not truly living. I was waiting, though for 18 years I never knew what I was waiting for. It was a Tuesday in October, 18 years after I had been left on that dusty road. Like all my days, this one was governed by a quiet, predictable rhythm. I left the library at 5 o'clock, walked the 12 blocks to my apartment, and let myself into the clean, silent space that I called home. The air inside was still, smelling faintly of the lemon oil I used to polish the bookshelves. My routine was a form of meditation, a series of small, controllable acts that kept the chaos of my inner world at bay. I put the kettle on for tea, changed out of my work clothes, and then, as I did every evening, I sorted through the mail. It was the usual collection of non-events. A bill for the electricity, a catalog for Scandinavian furniture, an alumni newsletter from the university I had attended as a ghost, addressed to Grace Miller. And then, at the bottom of the small pile, there was an envelope that did not belong. It was thin and flimsy, the paper slightly yellowed, as if it had been sitting in a drawer for years. The address was written in a shaky, spidery script. The ink faded from black to a watery gray. There was no return address, only a postmark from a town I'd never heard of in rural North Carolina. My heart gave a strange, unfamiliar flutter. No one wrote me letters. Grace Miller did not have a past that could produce such a thing. My first thought was that it was a mistake, meant for a previous tenant. But my name, Grace Miller, was there, clear as day. I carried it into my small living room and sat in my armchair, the kettle whistling forgotten in the kitchen. I slit the envelope open with a sense of foreboding, a feeling that I was about to touch something that had been buried for a long, long time. The single sheet of paper inside was folded into thirds, its creases worn and soft. I unfolded it. The handwriting matched the spidery script on the envelope. To the woman who calls herself Grace Miller, it began. A chill traced its way down my spine. My name is Catherine Allen. I don't know if you will remember me, but I was a nurse at a place called Sainte. Jude's Home for Wayward Girls, almost 2 decades ago. I am writing this letter because I am dying. The doctors say I have only a few weeks left, and there is a sin on my conscience that I cannot take with me to my grave. It concerns you and the baby boy you had there. The paper trembled in my hands. The room began to feel small, the air thin. St. Jude's. A name, a place. I had spent 18 years trying to burn from my memory. I forced myself to keep reading. I remember you. You were the quiet one with the sad old eyes. You named your son Leo. I was there in the room when he was born. I watched you hold him, and then I helped Mrs. Gable take him away from you. Tears pricked at my eyes, hot and sudden. The old familiar grief, my constant companion, rose up to choke me. I am writing to you because I have to tell you something. They paid me to lie about. Mrs. Gable told you your son had died. She told you he was weak. She lied. It was all a lie. I stopped reading. The words did not compute. They were a string of nonsensical symbols. He did not die. It was an impossibility, a sentence from a language I didn't speak. I read it again. And again. The world began to tilt on its axis, the quiet, orderly room dissolving into a dizzying vortex. My hands shaking uncontrollably, I forced my eyes back to the page. Your son, the baby you named Leo, he did not die. He was perfectly healthy. He was a strong, beautiful baby boy. I know because I was the one who held him that night after they took him from you. The man who paid for everything. Your grandfather, I think he was. A powerful man from downstate had arranged it all. He paid Mrs. Gable a fortune in cash. He paid the doctor, who wasn't a real doctor, to sign a fake death certificate. That night, after they told you he was gone, a lawyer came for him. A man in a dark suit driving a black car. I watched from the window as they handed your living, breathing son over to him for a private, sealed adoption. The letter fell from my numb fingers and fluttered to the floor. He did not die. The foundation of my entire adult life, a bedrock of grief built upon the unshakable fact of my son's death, cracked. And then it shattered into a million pieces. The 18 years I had spent mourning a ghost, the phantom ache in my arms, the silent, lonely birthdays I had marked for him, all of it was based on a lie. A monstrous, cruel, unthinkable lie. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel relief. What roared to life inside me, in the hollow space where grief had lived, was a white-hot, cleansing rage. It was an inferno that burned away the quiet, sad ghost of Grace Miller and left in her place the vengeful spirit of Emma Covington. They hadn't just taken him from me. They had performed the sickest of amputations and then forced me to spend 2 decades mourning the phantom limb, believing it was gone forever. They buried me alive in a tomb of their lies while my son, my Leo, was out there somewhere in the world, alive. My mind, so long dormant, now raced. He's alive. The thought was a drumbeat, a war cry. Where is he? Who raised him? What does he look like? Is he happy? Does he know he's adopted? Does he think I abandoned him? The questions were a torrent, a flood that broke the dam of my 18-year silence. I knelt and picked up the letter, my hands now steady. Catherine Allen had included the name of the lawyer she had overheard Mrs. Gable speaking to that night. She had included the name of the bank where she had seen the withdrawal slip for the cash payment. She had given me threads. For 18 years, my life's purpose had been to survive an ending, to endure a loss. I had done it. I had kept my vow. But now, standing in the ruins of my quiet, lonely life, I made a new one. My grief, so long a passive, stagnant thing, had been transformed into fuel. My survival was no longer enough. I would find him. I would unravel every thread of their lie, no matter how tangled, no matter how deep into the darkness it led me. I would find my son, and then I would burn the house of Covington to the ground. The hunt had just begun. The week after the letter arrived was a blur of frantic, focused activity. The quiet, solitary shell of Grace Miller was shed, and the determined, vengeful core of Emma Covington took command. I liquidated the small savings I had painstakingly accumulated over 18 years. I took a leave of absence from the library, citing a family emergency, a bitter, ironic phrase that tasted like acid on my tongue. My first and only priority was finding a lawyer. I didn't want a slick, high-powered firm from a downtown skyscraper. The Covingtons had lawyers like that on retainer. They could buy or intimidate them with a single phone call. I needed an outsider, a bulldog, someone with nothing to lose and a hunger for a fight. I found him on the 3rd page of an online search, his office located in a small, nondescript brick building on the far side of town. The name on the shingle was simple: James Reed, attorney at law. His office was exactly what I had hoped for, a cluttered, dusty room overflowing with file boxes and law books, smelling faintly of coffee and sheer tenacity. James Reed himself was younger than I expected, maybe 30, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing and a slightly rumpled suit that suggested he cared more about his cases than his dry cleaning. He looked at me with a professional, cautious curiosity. I didn't cry. I didn't get hysterical. I sat across the desk from him and laid out my story with the same calm, methodical precision I used to catalog a new collection of books. I told him about Harmony Creek, about St. Jude's, about the son I thought was dead. And then I placed the thin, crinkled letter from Catherine Allen on the desk between us. He listened patiently, his expression unreadable. He read the letter twice, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he was done, he leaned back in his squeaky office chair and steepled his fingers, looking at me for a long, silent moment. "Ms. Miller," he began, his voice gentle, but laced with skepticism. "This is an extraordinary story. The people you're accusing, the Covingtons, they are an institution in this state. What you're alleging, a faked death, a secret illegal adoption orchestrated by the patriarch. It's the kind of thing you read in a paperback thriller." He paused. "Are you absolutely certain of your memories? Trauma can do strange things to a person's mind." He thought I was delusional. I had expected it. "I am not Ms. Miller," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "My name is Emma Covington. And the only thing strange about my mind is that I managed to stay sane after what they did to me. I know what happened. I know he was alive. And that letter is my proof." He looked from the letter back to my face. He saw something in my eyes then, I think. He saw the 18 years of carefully contained grief and the new burning fire of my rage. He saw that I was not a woman with a fantasy. I was a woman with a mission, and I would not be deterred. The cynical lawyer vanished, replaced by an intrigued investigator. "All right, Emma," he said, the use of my real name a quiet acknowledgement. "The odds are astronomical, but if even half of what's in this letter is true, well, I didn't get into this business to write wills. Our partnership was formed on that dusty desk, a pact sealed by a dying nurse's confession. James was brilliant. He started not by attacking the Covingtons, but by verifying the letter. He confirmed that a Catherine Allen had indeed died of pancreatic cancer in that small North Carolina town on the date specified. He found her old nursing license records. She had worked at St. Jude's during that period. The foundation was solid. The next step was the lawyer mentioned in the letter. He was long retired, living in a gated community in Naples, Florida. James flew down. The old man, withered and terrified, tried to deny everything, but James was relentless. He presented him with the letter, with evidence of his presence in the area at the time, and laid out the legal consequences for his role in a fraudulent adoption. The old lawyer crumbled. He didn't give up everything, but he gave up a name, the name of the bank where the trust was established, and a single, vital detail. The trust was set up not in the baby's name, but under a coded corporate designation. That was the key. We weren't looking for a needle in a haystack. We were looking for the financial records of the devil himself. James filed a blizzard of subpoenas. For weeks, we were met with stonewalls and legal delays, and then, one day, a dusty box of old bank ledgers from 2 decades ago arrived at the office. We spent 2 days hunched over the fragile pages, the air thick with the smell of old paper, our eyes straining to read the faded ink. And then we found it. A single line item in a corporate holdings account belonging to Arthur Covington. A transfer of $250,000, an immense sum at the time, to a newly created, anonymously named trust. The date of the transfer was 1 week after the day Leo was born. "This is it," James breathed, his finger tracing the line. "This is the devil's ledger." The existence of this trust, founded on the date of a now verifiable fraudulent birth, was the leverage James needed. He filed an emergency petition with the court, arguing that a crime had been committed and that the sealed adoption records connected to this criminally funded trust had to be opened. A week later, a sealed manila envelope arrived by court courier. My heart was pounding so hard, I felt it in my teeth. This was it, the answer, the name of the family who had my son. James took a deep breath and slid a letter opener under the flap. He pulled out a single stapled document. His eyes scanned it, his expression growing grim. "What is it?" I asked, my voice a hoarse whisper. "Who are they?" He looked up from the paper, his eyes filled with a pained sort of disbelief. He looked at me, and I knew, before he even spoke, that the truth was going to be worse than anything I had imagined. "The adoptive parents," he said slowly, "are listed as Thomas and Marianne Covington." The name hit me like a physical blow. I stumbled back, grabbing the edge of the desk for support. Covington. It has to be a coincidence, a different family with the same name. James shook his head, his face grim. "I don't think so," he said, looking back at the paper. According to this, they live in a small town in western North Carolina. I did a quick search while we were waiting. Thomas Covington's grandfather and Arthur Covington's father were brothers. They're distant cousins. The room began to spin. The cluttered office, James's concerned face, the damning piece of paper in his hand. It all warped into a sickening, incomprehensible nightmare. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture of such monstrous, narcissistic evil that it stole the breath from my lungs. Arthur hadn't gotten rid of the baby to hide his shame. He had relocated him. He didn't want to erase the evidence of his crime. He wanted to curate it. He had handpicked a poorer, weaker branch of the family, set them up with a trust fund, and given them his own bloodline to raise, ensuring the boy would be brought up with the Covington name and values, but far from the scandal, all while under his silent financial control. It wasn't a cover-up. It was a long-term investment in his own perverse legacy. He hadn't thrown my son away. He had planted him in a garden of his own choosing, to be cultivated and watched from afar. My son was not lost. He was placed. My hunt for a nameless, faceless boy was over. He had a name. He had a family, and he was a Covington. The rage that had been my fuel was now joined by a cold, terrifying horror. My grandfather hadn't just committed a crime. He had created a secret dynasty from the ashes of my soul. The drive back to Harmony Creek was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. Every familiar curve in the road, every small town I passed through, was a landmark from my past, but I was seeing it through new eyes. 18 years ago, this had been a journey into exile, a passage into darkness as a terrified, broken girl. Now, I was a 36-year-old woman driving toward a reckoning, my path illuminated by the burning light of a terrible truth. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, crystalline purpose. When I saw the faded green sign, "Welcome to Harmony Creek, population 4,312, I didn't feel a pang of nostalgia. I felt like a general surveying a battlefield before the first charge. The town looked smaller, sadder, its quaint charm now seeming like a thin, brittle veneer over something rotten. I didn't drive to the Covington estate, not yet. I checked into a sterile, anonymous motel on the highway, a neutral territory from which I would launch my assault. I laid out the contents of my leather briefcase on the cheap bedspread, the nurse's letter, copies of the bank ledgers, and the court-sealed adoption papers. My weapons were not made of steel, but of paper and truth. The next morning, I made the call. I dialed the number to the house from memory, my fingers steady. A housekeeper I didn't recognize answered. "May I speak to Sarah Covington?" I asked, my voice even, calm. A moment later, my mother's voice, thinner and more frayed than I remembered, came on the line. "Hello?" "Hello, Mother," I said. There was a sharp intake of breath, then a long, strangled silence. "Emma, is that really you?" "I will be at the house tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock, I said, cutting through her flustered shock. "See to it that everyone is there." "Arthur, Eleanor, David, and Michael. Everyone. We have something to discuss." I didn't wait for a reply. I ended the call, leaving them to 24 hours of panicked speculation. The power, for the first time in my life, was mine. The next day, at precisely 2 o'clock, I drove my unremarkable sedan up the long, curving driveway. The house, which had loomed so large and menacing in my memory, now just seemed old. The white paint of the pillars was peeling slightly. Weeds pushed up through the cracks in the flagstone walkway. The grand facade was beginning to crumble. I walked to the front door and rang the bell. Moments later, it was opened by my father. The 18 years had not been kind to him. He was paunchy now, his hair a thin gray wash, his face a road map of worry and weakness. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "Emma," he breathed. "Hello, David," I said coolly, stepping past him into the foyer. He led me into the formal living room. They were all there, a gallery of decay. My brother, Michael, looking puffy and self-important, though his eyes darted nervously. My mother, Sarah, thinner, more anxious, twisting a handkerchief in her hands. My grandmother, Eleanor, sat ramrod straight in her favorite armchair, but the iron had gone out of her spine. She looked withered, a queen presiding over a dying kingdom. And then there was Arthur. He was old. He was a frail, shrunken version of the Titan who haunted my nightmares, but the malevolence in his pale blue eyes was as potent as ever. He was the first to speak, his voice a raspy imitation of its former boom. "Well, the prodigal daughter returns," he sneered. "I assume you finally run out of the money we so generously gave you and have come crawling back for more." I allowed a small, cold smile to touch my lips. I walked to the heavy coffee table in the center of the room and placed my leather briefcase upon it. The click of the latches was unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "I'm not here for your money, Arthur," I said, my voice resonating with a calm authority that silenced them all. "I'm here for a reckoning." I opened the briefcase. One by one, I laid my weapons on the polished wood. "Exhibit A," I announced, placing the nurse's letter on the table. "A deathbed confession from a woman named Catherine Allen. She details the night my son was born at St. Jude's, a facility you paid handsomely to keep your secret." My mother let out a small, strangled gasp. "Exhibit B," I continued, laying out the copies of the bank ledgers. "Financial records. They show a payment of $250,000, transferred from one of your holding companies into a blind trust, 1 week after the birth of the child you told me had died." David made a choking sound, his face ashen. He looked like he was going to be sick. "And Exhibit C," I said, my voice dropping slightly as I held up the final document. "This is the most important piece of paper in this room. It is the sealed adoption record for my son, Leo." I let the name hang in the air, a name they had never heard, a name I had whispered only to him. I watched their faces as the reality of the document sank in. Then I looked directly at Arthur and delivered the final, killing blow. "But you didn't just give him away to strangers to hide your shame, did you? That would have been too simple, too wasteful. You gave him to your cousins, Thomas and Marianne Covington." I let the name land, watching the comprehension dawn on their faces. "You didn't want to destroy the evidence of your crime. You wanted to control it. You wanted to cultivate your own twisted legacy from a safe distance, didn't you, Arthur? A secret heir, born of my pain." The carefully constructed composure of the Covington family shattered like glass. David began to weep, deep, racking sobs of a man whose cowardice had finally caught up with him. Sarah just stared into space, her mouth agape, her mind finally broken by a truth too ugly to deny. Michael's arrogant facade crumbled, replaced by a look of slack-jawed, horrified disbelief. Eleanor, the iron matriarch, simply closed her eyes. She didn't faint, she didn't cry. She just deflated, as if the strings holding her upright had been cut. A statue of ice, finally cracked by the heat of the truth. Only Arthur fought. "Lies," he rasped, struggling to push himself up from his armchair, his face turning a dark, mottled red. "Forgeries, all of it, the delusions of a—" His words choked off. His hand flew to his chest. A look of genuine surprise crossed his face, and he collapsed back into the chair, his body convulsing, a gurgling sound escaping his lips. The room erupted into a new kind of chaos. My mother's shrieks, my father's panicked cries for someone to call an ambulance. In the center of it all, I stood perfectly still. The house of cards had fallen. The patriarch, the monster who had haunted my life, had been struck down not by a knife or a bullet, but by the simple, undeniable weight of his own sins. I did not feel triumph. I did not feel joy. I felt the profound tectonic shift of a world being set right. The war was over. The Covington Empire, built on a foundation of secrets and lies, had died right here in this room, not with a bang, but with the rustle of paper and the final, wheezing gasp of a devil undone by his own ledger. Arthur Covington died before the ambulance reached the hospital. His heart, so long a vessel of cold, calculated malice, had simply given out, unable to withstand the public demolition of his life's work. His death was not the beginning of the end for the Covington Empire. It was merely the final, undignified punctuation mark. The story, my story, could not be contained. It seeped out from the walls of the manor like a pestilence, first in whispers around Harmony Creek, then in a torrent of scandal that washed over the state. The tale of the Covington patriarch, the secret child, and the 18-year conspiracy was too lurid, too monstrous to remain hidden. The family name, once a symbol of Southern aristocracy and power, became a synonym for perversion and decay. The business holdings, built on a reputation that was now worthless, crumbled. My family scattered like rats from a sinking ship. David and Sarah sold the manor for a fraction of its worth and disappeared to Florida to live out their days in a self-imposed exile of shame. Michael, his future prospects annihilated, moved out west and fell off the map entirely. Eleanor remained, a silent, withered ghost in a nursing home, refusing all visitors, entombed in the final, crushing silence she had so long championed. The house of cards had not just fallen, the wind had blown it all to dust. I had won. The justice I sought had been delivered, swift and absolute. But the victory felt strangely hollow. The rage that had fueled me for months had burned out, and in its place was a vast, quiet emptiness. Destroying them hadn't healed me. It hadn't brought Leo back. It had simply closed a dark and bloody chapter of my life. I returned to my small apartment in Atlanta, to the quiet life of Grace Miller, and felt a profound sense of dislocation. The war was over, but I didn't know how to live in the peace. James Reed, my loyal, tireless lawyer, became my only bridge to the next chapter. With the utmost care and sensitivity, he acted as an intermediary. He contacted Thomas and Mary Ann Covington, the quiet, unsuspecting couple who had been used as pawns in Arthur's grand, twisted game. They were, by all accounts, simple, decent people, and the truth of their sons, their nephews, origin devastated them. And then there was Leo. An 18-year-old boy on the cusp of his own life, suddenly told that his entire identity was a lie, told that his great-grandfather was also his father, told that his birth mother, whom he likely never thought of, had been mourning his death for his entire life. It was an impossible, soul-crushing weight to place on a young man's shoulders. It took weeks of phone calls between James and Leo's parents. Weeks for the shock to subside into a million painful questions. And then one day, James called me. Leo wanted to meet me. We chose a neutral space, a small cafe with outdoor tables in a park halfway between Atlanta and his town in North Carolina. I arrived an hour early, my hands trembling as I clutched a cup of coffee I couldn't drink. I had faced down my entire family armed with righteous fury. But sitting here, waiting to meet the son I had only known for a few precious moments as an infant, I was terrified. And then I saw him. He was walking across the grass towards the cafe, a tall, lanky boy with dark, wavy hair and a tentative, cautious way of moving. He wasn't a baby. He wasn't the abstract idea of a son I had mourned. He was a person. A young man, a stranger. He had my mother's mouth, but his eyes were the same pale, piercing blue as Arthur's. Seeing them in his young, innocent face was a jarring, painful reminder of the poison in his roots. He sat down opposite me. For a long moment, we just looked at each other, two strangers connected by an unspeakable trauma. "Hi," he said finally, his voice quiet. "Hi, Leo," I replied, the name feeling both sacred and strange on my tongue. The conversation that followed was not a magical, tearful reunion. It was awkward and painful, full of halting phrases and long, difficult silences. He was grappling with a truth that had shattered his world. I was meeting a ghost who had come back to life. There was no script for this. He asked questions, his voice tight with a mixture of anger, hurt, and confusion. I answered them as honestly as I could. I told him about the night he was born, about his name, about the 18 years I had spent believing he was gone. I apologized. Not for giving him up, I never did that, but for the simple, horrific fact of his existence, for the terrible story that was now his to carry. "It's not your fault," he said, and those 4 words were a balm on a wound I didn't even know was still open. He told me about his life. He played soccer. He was good at physics. He was thinking of studying engineering. He showed me a picture of his dog from his wallet. I told him I was a librarian. We talked about books. For a few brief moments, we were just 2 people getting to know each other, the monstrous shadow of our shared history receding just enough for us to see the person sitting across the table. When it was time to go, we stood, and the awkwardness returned. There were no hugs, no promises of a happy future. It was too soon for that. I'll call you, he said. I'd like that, I replied, and then he turned and walked away. I watched him go until he was out of sight. It was not a happy ending, but it was a beginning. And for the first time in a very, very long time, I felt a flicker of something that was not grief, not rage, not even survival. It was hope. That was years ago. Our story did not magically become simple. Healing is not a single event. It is a long and quiet process. Building a relationship with Leo has been a journey of patience and grace, of navigating a minefield of pain to find a small, solid patch of common ground. We are still, in many ways, strangers. But we are strangers who are learning to become family on our own terms. They tried to write my story for me, to end it in darkness and silence. They tried to make me a tragic footnote in the grand, corrupt saga of the Covington family, but they forgot one thing. I was the one holding the pen. And I decided to write a different ending, one with truth, one with hope, one with a sunrise after the longest night.